The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as 10-year-old Timothy Matthews pressed his face against the cold iron railings. His breath created small clouds in the crisp London air, and his knuckles turned white from gripping the metal bars so tightly. For 3 weeks now, he had made the same journey from his grandmother's flat in Westminster, walking the familiar streets to stand at these very gates. Timothy wasn't like other children who came to gawk at the palace or hope for a glimpse of royalty. His mission was far more urgent, far more desperate. Hidden beneath his worn blue jacket was a crumpled envelope containing a letter that could change everything for his family. The problem was getting it to the right person. His grandmother, Eleanor Matthews, had worked as a seamstress in the palace for over 30 years before her retirement. She knew secrets that most people could never imagine, stories of kindness and humanity that existed behind the formal facade of royal protocol. When Timothy's father had been wrongfully imprisoned 3 months ago, accused of a crime he didn't commit, Eleanor had remembered something important. She recalled a conversation from years past, overhearing a member of the royal family express concern about the justice system's treatment of ordinary working families. The letter in Timothy's jacket contained evidence that could prove his father's innocence. His grandmother had spent weeks gathering witness statements and documents, but every official channel they tried had led to dead ends. Lawyers were too expensive, and their family had no connections in high places. Eleanor's old contacts at the palace had either retired or moved on, leaving them with no direct way to reach anyone who might help. That's when Eleanor remembered something else from her years of service. She told Timothy about the guards, particularly one guard who had always been different from the others. Sergeant James Morrison had worked at the palace for 15 years, and Eleanor had noticed his genuine care for people who came seeking help. Unlike other guards who strictly followed protocol, Morrison had a reputation for bending rules when someone truly needed assistance. Timothy had been watching the guards for weeks now, learning their routines and trying to identify Morrison. His grandmother had described him as tall with graying hair and kind eyes, but that description fit several of the guards. Timothy needed to be absolutely certain before making his move, because he would likely only get one chance. During his daily vigils at the gate, Timothy had noticed patterns in how the guards behaved. Most maintained strict professional distance from the crowd of tourists and onlookers. They answered basic questions politely but kept interactions brief. However, one guard was different. This particular guard would sometimes spend extra time with elderly visitors, helping them with directions or patiently answering their questions about palace history. Timothy watched as this guard helped a confused elderly woman find her way to the nearest tube station. He observed how the guard's expression softened when a small child waved at him. These small acts of kindness convinced Timothy that this must be Sergeant Morrison, the man his grandmother had described. The challenge now was creating an opportunity to approach him. Timothy couldn't simply walk up during the changing of the guard ceremony when hundreds of tourists were present. He needed a moment when Morrison was alone, or at least not surrounded by crowds. He also needed to find a way to communicate the urgency of his situation without causing alarm or drawing unwanted attention from other guards. Timothy began timing the guard rotations more carefully. He noticed that Morrison often took a position near the main gate during the quieter afternoon hours. There was usually a 15-minute window when foot traffic was lighter. Just after the lunch crowd dispersed but before the evening tourists arrived, his grandmother had taught him to be resourceful and patient. She often said that the right opportunity would present itself if he remained watchful and prepared. Timothy carried the letter with him every day, along with a small photo of his father that he kept in his pocket for courage. The weight of responsibility sat heavily on Timothy's young shoulders. His mother had been working double shifts as a cleaning lady to pay for legal fees, often coming home exhausted and worried. His younger sister Emma didn't fully understand why their father wasn't coming home, and Timothy had taken on the role of trying to keep her spirits up while managing his own fears and frustrations. School had become difficult for Timothy. His grades were slipping, and he found it hard to concentrate on lessons when his mind was constantly occupied with plans to help his father. His teachers had noticed the change in his behavior, but attributed it to normal childhood difficulties. None of them knew about the enormous burden this 10-year-old boy was carrying. Each night, Timothy would return to his grandmother's flat and report his observations. Eleanor would listen carefully, offering gentle guidance and encouragement. She reminded him that sometimes the most important acts of courage happened quietly, without fanfare or recognition. She told him stories of other times in history when ordinary people had made extraordinary differences through determination and clever thinking. As Timothy stood at the palace gates on this particular morning, he felt a mixture of nervousness and determination coursing through him. He had been studying Sergeant Morrison's routine for days now, and he believed he had identified the perfect moment to make his approach. The plan he had developed was simple but required perfect timing and a considerable amount of courage for someone his age. The letter in his jacket seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Timothy knew that his father's appeal hearing was scheduled for the following week, and if new evidence wasn't presented soon, his father could spend years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. The pressure of this timeline made every day at the palace gates feel more crucial than the last. Timothy took a deep breath and checked his watch. It was almost time for the afternoon guard rotation. His heart began beating faster as he prepared to put his carefully planned approach into action. Everything his family's future depended on would come down to the next few moments and whether a royal guard would be willing to listen to a desperate young boy's plea for help. Timothy's hands trembled slightly as he watched Sergeant Morrison take his position near the main gate. The afternoon crowd had thinned considerably, and most of the remaining tourists were focused on taking photographs of the palace's impressive architecture. This was the moment Timothy had been waiting for, but now that it had arrived, his courage wavered. He had spent hours the previous night with his grandmother, perfecting what they called the signal. Eleanor had remembered that during her years at the palace, there was an old understanding among the staff about certain gestures that indicated genuine distress or urgent need for help. It wasn't an official protocol, but rather an informal system that had developed over decades among the palace workers who occasionally encountered people in desperate situations. The signal was simple, but specific. Timothy needed to approach the gate, place his right hand over his heart, and then extend his left hand toward the guard with his palm facing up. This gesture, when held for exactly 10 seconds, was supposed to communicate that someone needed help with a matter of justice or urgent family crisis. Eleanor wasn't entirely certain that Morrison would recognize the signal, as it had been used primarily among inside staff, but it was their best hope for getting his attention without causing a scene. Timothy waited until a group of elderly tourists finished asking Morrison for directions. As they walked away, chattering excitedly about their palace visit, Timothy saw his opportunity. He approached the gate slowly, trying to appear casual despite his racing heartbeat. When he was about 6 feet away from Morrison, he stopped and made eye contact with the guard. Morrison looked down at the boy with the same polite expression he used for all visitors. Timothy could see the kindness in his eyes that his grandmother had described, but also the professional reserve that came with years of palace duty. This was the moment of truth. Timothy placed his right hand over his heart and extended his left hand toward Morrison, palm up. He held the position exactly as his grandmother had instructed, counting slowly to 10 in his head while maintaining eye contact with the guard. For a moment, Morrison's expression didn't change, and Timothy felt his heart sink. Perhaps the signal was too old, or maybe Morrison had never learned about it. Then something shifted in Morrison's face. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion but in recognition. Timothy saw the guard's posture change almost imperceptibly as he glanced around to assess their surroundings. Morrison stepped closer to the gate, close enough that he could speak to Timothy in a low voice without being overheard. "Young man," Morrison said quietly, "do you know what you just did?" Timothy nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "My grandmother Eleanor Matthews taught me. She used to work here as a seamstress. She said you might be able to help us." Recognition flashed across Morrison's face at the mention of Eleanor's name. He remembered her well from his early years at the palace. Eleanor had been one of the staff members who had helped him understand the unwritten rules and traditions that made palace life function smoothly. She had always been known for her discretion and her genuine care for others. "Eleanor Matthews," Morrison repeated softly. "How is she? I haven't seen her since her retirement." "She's well, sir, but our family is in terrible trouble. My father has been wrongfully imprisoned, and we have evidence that could prove his innocence." Grandmother said you might know how to get this information to someone who could help. Morrison glanced around again, noting that they were attracting some curious looks from passing tourists. He needed to be careful about how this conversation proceeded. Palace guards were strictly forbidden from engaging in discussions about political matters or legal cases with members of the public. But Morrison also understood the informal tradition that Timothy's signal represented. "I cannot discuss such matters here," Morrison said carefully. "But I remember your grandmother's kindness to me when I was new to this position. If you return here tomorrow at exactly 3 o'clock, I may be able to suggest some proper channels for your family to explore." Timothy felt a surge of hope mixed with frustration. He had hoped for more immediate action, but he understood that Morrison had to be cautious. "Sir, there's something else. The evidence we have is time-sensitive. My father's appeal hearing is next week, and if this information isn't presented soon, he could spend years in prison for something he didn't do." Morrison's expression grew more serious. He had worked at the palace long enough to know that sometimes urgent situations required creative solutions, but he also knew the risks involved in stepping outside established protocols. He studied Timothy's face, seeing the desperation and sincerity there. "What kind of evidence?" Morrison asked quietly. Timothy carefully reached into his jacket and showed Morrison the corner of the envelope without fully removing it. "Witness statements and documents that prove my father was somewhere else when the crime happened. We've tried going through lawyers and official channels, but no one will listen to us. We don't have money for expensive legal help, and our family has no connections." Morrison found himself in a difficult position. His training and experience told him to refer Timothy to official channels and avoid getting involved in legal matters. However, his personal values and his respect for Eleanor Matthews made him want to help. He also recognized that sometimes the formal system failed people who most needed justice. "Your grandmother taught you well about the old ways," Morrison said thoughtfully. "But you must understand that I cannot make any promises. The palace operates under very strict rules, and I cannot act outside my authority." "I understand, sir. But could you at least look at what we have? Maybe you could tell us if it's the kind of evidence that someone important should see." Morrison considered this request carefully. Looking at documents wouldn't necessarily violate his duties, and his experience might help him assess whether Timothy's family had a legitimate case worth pursuing through proper channels. "Tomorrow at 3 o'clock, Morrison repeated. "Come alone and bring your grandmother's letter of reference if she has one. I will need to verify your connection to her before we proceed with any discussion." Timothy nodded eagerly. "Thank you, sir. You don't know how much this means to our family." "I'm not promising anything beyond a conversation," Morrison warned. "But Eleanor Matthews earned my respect long ago, and I believe in honoring the debts we owe to good people." As Timothy walked away from the palace gates, he felt a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. He had successfully made contact with Morrison, and the guard seemed willing to at least listen to their story. However, he also understood that this was just the first step in what could be a very complicated process. The weight of his family's hopes rested heavily on Timothy's shoulders as he made his way back to his grandmother's flat. He had 24 hours to prepare for what might be the most important conversation of his young life. Eleanor Matthews sat in her small kitchen, carefully penning a letter of reference by lamplight. Her weathered hands moved slowly but steadily across the paper as she recalled memories from her 3 decades of service at Buckingham Palace. Timothy sat across from her, watching anxiously as his grandmother crafted what could be their family's lifeline. "Sergeant Morrison was always different from the other guards," Eleanor said as she wrote. "When he first arrived at the palace 15 years ago, he was young and eager but also genuinely concerned about people. I remember helping him understand how things really worked there, beyond the official protocols." She paused in her writing to look at Timothy. "You did well today, child. Using the old signal took courage, and Morrison's willingness to meet with you tomorrow shows that he remembers the bonds we formed during those years." Timothy fidgeted with the envelope containing the evidence about his father's case. "Grandmother, what if he looks at our evidence and says he can't help? What if the rules are too strict for him to do anything?" Eleanor set down her pen and reached across the table to take Timothy's hand. "Then we will have tried our best and we'll find another way. But I believe Morrison is a man of conscience. If our evidence is as strong as we think it is, he'll find a way to get it to the right people." The evidence they had gathered was indeed compelling. Timothy's father, Robert Matthews, had been accused of stealing valuable tools from the construction site where he worked as a foreman. The theft had occurred on a Tuesday evening, but Eleanor had managed to track down 3 witnesses who could testify that Robert had been helping his elderly neighbor repair her roof that same evening, 20 miles away from the construction site. Additionally, Eleanor had discovered that the construction company's security guard, who had originally reported seeing Robert near the tool storage area, had been fired from 2 previous jobs for falsifying reports. This information hadn't been presented during Robert's trial because the family couldn't afford an investigator to uncover the guard's employment history. The most damaging piece of evidence against Robert had been the discovery of one of the stolen tools in his personal truck. However, Eleanor had found a witness who saw the security guard placing something in Robert's truck the day after the theft was reported. The witness had thought it was suspicious at the time, but hadn't known how to report it or whom to tell. "The truth is all here," Eleanor said, tapping the envelope. "The problem has been getting anyone in authority to look at it seriously. Your father's court-appointed lawyer barely spent an hour reviewing the case before advising him to plead guilty for a reduced sentence." Timothy remembered the day his father had refused that plea bargain, insisting on his innocence even though it meant risking a longer prison sentence. Robert Matthews was a proud man who had worked hard his entire life to provide for his family and maintain his reputation in the community. The idea of admitting to a crime he didn't commit was unthinkable to him. The next morning, Timothy woke early and helped his grandmother prepare for what they hoped would be a breakthrough meeting. Eleanor had written a detailed letter explaining Timothy's identity and their family's connection to her years of palace service. She had also included specific memories that only Morrison would know, details about conversations and incidents from years past that would confirm the letter's authenticity. "Remember," Eleanor instructed as Timothy prepared to leave, "be respectful but honest. Don't exaggerate our situation, but make sure he understands how urgent this is. Morrison is a good man, but he's also bound by rules and responsibilities that we may not fully understand." Timothy arrived at the palace gates 30 minutes early, wanting to observe Morrison and choose the best moment for their conversation. He watched as the afternoon guard rotation took place, noting that Morrison seemed more alert than usual, occasionally glancing toward the area where Timothy had approached him the day before. At exactly 3 o'clock, Timothy approached the gate. Morrison saw him coming and moved to a position where they could speak with some privacy. Timothy handed him Eleanor's letter, watching nervously as the guard read it carefully. Morrison's expression softened as he read about incidents and conversations from years past. Eleanor had written about a time when Morrison had helped her carry heavy fabric samples up several flights of stairs after she had injured her back. She mentioned how he had once shared his lunch with her when she had forgotten to bring food to work. These personal details convinced Morrison that the letter was genuine. "Your grandmother writes that you have evidence regarding your father's wrongful imprisonment," Morrison said quietly. "I must tell you that I cannot involve myself directly in legal matters, but I may be able to advise you on proper channels if your evidence appears credible." Timothy carefully removed the envelope from his jacket and handed it to Morrison. "Everything is in here, sir. Witness statements, documents about the security guard's false reports, and testimony about my father's whereabouts when the crime happened." Morrison looked around to ensure they weren't being observed, then opened the envelope and began reviewing its contents. Timothy watched his face carefully, trying to gauge his reaction to the evidence. Morrison's expression grew increasingly serious as he read through the witness statements and documentation. "This is substantial evidence," Morrison said after several minutes. "If these witness statements are accurate and can be verified, they could indeed prove your father's innocence. The question is how to get this information properly presented to the court system. We've tried everything we can think of," Timothy said. "Nobody will listen to us because we're just ordinary working people with no connections or money for expensive lawyers." Morrison folded the documents carefully and handed them back to Timothy. "There may be a way to help, but it would require discretion and careful timing. I know someone who works in the palace's correspondence office. This person occasionally handles requests for royal intervention in cases involving miscarriages of justice." Timothy's eyes widened with hope. "Do you think the royal family might help our father?" "I cannot make any promises about royal involvement," Morrison said carefully. But I can tell you that there are established procedures for bringing credible evidence of wrongful conviction to the attention of people who have connections to the proper authorities. The key word is credible, and based on what I've seen, your family's evidence appears to meet that standard. Morrison explained that he would need to present the case very carefully to his contact in the correspondence office. The person would need to be convinced that the evidence was genuine, and that the case represented a serious miscarriage of justice worthy of special attention. "What do you need from us?" Timothy asked. "Patience and absolute discretion," Morrison replied. "If word gets out that palace staff are involving themselves in legal matters, it could create problems for everyone involved, including your family." "Can you trust me to handle this properly?" Timothy nodded emphatically. "Yes, sir. We trust you completely. Come back here in 3 days at the same time. I should have an answer for you by then. And Timothy, remember that even if my contact agrees to help, the legal process will still take time. Justice moves slowly, but if your evidence is as strong as it appears, truth has a way of prevailing." The 3 days that followed Morrison's promise felt like the longest of Timothy's life. Each hour seemed to crawl by as he tried to maintain normal routines while his mind raced with possibilities and fears. His grandmother, Eleanor, noticed his restlessness and did her best to keep him occupied with small tasks and encouraging conversation, but nothing could truly distract him from the weight of waiting. During this time, Sergeant Morrison was conducting his own careful investigation within the palace walls. He had served there long enough to understand the delicate network of relationships and protocols that governed how information flowed through the institution. His contact in the correspondence office was Margaret Whitfield, a woman in her 50s who had worked at the palace for over 20 years and had earned a reputation for her discretion and judgment. Morrison approached Margaret during a quiet moment in the staff break room, away from the ears of other employees. He explained Timothy's situation carefully, emphasizing the strength of the evidence and the urgent timeline created by the upcoming appeal hearing. Margaret listened intently, asking detailed questions about the family's background and the nature of the evidence they had gathered. "James," Margaret said thoughtfully, "you know I've handled dozens of requests for intervention over the years. Most of them, sadly, don't meet the threshold for special attention, but what you're describing sounds like it could be a genuine case of wrongful conviction." She explained that the palace received hundreds of letters each month from people seeking help with legal problems, financial difficulties, or other personal crises. The vast majority of these requests had to be politely declined and referred to appropriate government agencies or charitable organizations. However, there were rare cases where evidence of serious injustice warranted bringing the matter to the attention of higher authorities. "The key," Margaret continued, "is whether the evidence is not only compelling, but also whether it represents a failure of the normal justice system that requires extraordinary intervention. From what you've told me, this case seems to meet both criteria." Margaret agreed to review Timothy's evidence personally, with the understanding that she could make no promises about the outcome. Morrison felt a mixture of relief and continued anxiety, as he realized he had successfully taken the first step in getting the case proper attention, but he also understood that many obstacles still lay ahead. Meanwhile, Timothy's mother, Sarah, was struggling with her own set of challenges. Working double shifts as a cleaning lady barely provided enough income to cover the family's basic expenses, let alone the costs associated with legal appeals. She had been forced to take on additional cleaning jobs in the evenings, often returning home after Timothy and Emma were already asleep. Sarah knew nothing about Timothy's activities at the palace gates. Eleanor had convinced her grandson to keep their efforts secret for now, explaining that raising false hopes could be cruel if their plan failed. Sarah was focused on more traditional approaches to helping her husband, including trying to raise money for a better lawyer and reaching out to local advocacy groups for assistance. The strain of the situation was evident in every aspect of the family's daily life. Emma, Timothy's 7-year-old sister, had begun having nightmares about their father never coming home. Timothy often found himself comforting her in the middle of the night, telling her stories and promising that everything would work out. Even though he wasn't certain of that himself, at school, Timothy's teachers continued to notice changes in his behavior and academic performance. His normally cheerful demeanor had been replaced by distraction and worry. During recess, while other children played games and laughed together, Timothy often stood alone, lost in thoughts about his family's situation and wondering what was happening at the palace. On the morning of the third day, Timothy woke before dawn, unable to sleep any longer. He helped his grandmother prepare breakfast and tried to eat, but his stomach was too knotted with anxiety to accept much food. Eleanor noticed his nervous energy and suggested they take a walk through the neighborhood to pass time before his afternoon meeting with Morrison. As they walked through the familiar streets of Westminster, Eleanor shared more stories about her years at the palace and the various people she had known there. She told Timothy about times when she had witnessed small acts of kindness that had made enormous differences in people's lives. These stories were intended to reassure him that good people in positions of authority often found ways to help when the situation truly warranted it. The palace employs thousands of people, Eleanor explained, and most of them genuinely care about serving the public good. They understand that sometimes helping one family can represent something much larger about fairness and justice in society. At exactly 3 o'clock, Timothy stood once again at the palace gates, his heart pounding as he waited for Morrison to acknowledge him. The guard appeared more serious than usual, and Timothy couldn't tell from his expression whether the news would be good or bad. Morrison approached the gate and spoke in the same quiet tone they had used during their previous conversations. "Timothy, I've spoken with my contact about your family's situation. She has agreed to review your evidence personally and, if she finds it credible, to bring it to the attention of people who have connections to the appropriate authorities." Timothy felt a surge of hope, but Morrison's serious expression warned him not to celebrate yet. However, Morrison continued, "You must understand that this process involves several steps, and there are no guarantees about the outcome. My contact will need to verify the authenticity of your evidence and confirm that it meets the criteria for special intervention." Morrison explained that Margaret Whitfield would need to see the original documents and witness statements, not just copies. She would also want to interview Eleanor about her years of palace service to confirm the family's credibility. If these initial reviews went well, the case would then be presented to a senior member of the palace staff who specialized in matters involving justice and legal affairs. "What do we need to do?" Timothy asked. "Tomorrow at 2 o'clock, you and your grandmother should come to the staff entrance on the east side of the palace. Ask for Margaret Whitfield in the correspondence office. She will be expecting you. Bring all of your original evidence and any additional documentation your grandmother might have about her years of service here." Morrison paused and looked directly into Timothy's eyes. "Timothy, I want you to understand that we are now in territory that could have serious consequences for everyone involved if this process is mishandled. Margaret is taking a significant professional risk by agreeing to see you. Your family must handle this with complete discretion." "We understand, sir. We won't tell anyone what's happening until we know if you can help us." "Good. And Timothy, regardless of what happens with this case, you should know that what you've done to help your father shows remarkable courage and determination. Your grandmother would be proud of the young man you're becoming." As Timothy walked away from the palace gates, he felt a complex mixture of emotions. The meeting with Margaret Whitfield represented their best hope for getting his father's case the attention it deserved. But he also understood that they were entering uncharted territory, with significant risks for everyone involved. Eleanor Matthews spent the evening before their crucial meeting, organizing every document and photograph from her 30 years of palace service. She had kept meticulous records of her time there, including letters of commendation, photographs from staff events, and even small mementos that colleagues had given her upon her retirement. These items would serve as proof of her credibility and long-standing connection to the palace community. Timothy watched his grandmother work with methodical precision, arranging documents in chronological order and preparing a brief summary of her service record. Eleanor's hands were steady despite her age, and her attention to detail reflected the same careful approach that had made her valued during her years as a palace seamstress. "Grandmother," Timothy said quietly, "what if they look at our evidence and decide it's not strong enough? What if we've come this far just to be turned away?" Eleanor paused in her organizing and sat down beside her grandson. "Timothy, we've already accomplished something remarkable. We've gotten the attention of people who work inside the palace, people who understand how the system works. Even if this particular avenue doesn't lead where we hope, we've learned things that could help us find other ways to help your father," she continued. But I believe our evidence is strong. The witness statements are detailed and consistent. The information about the security guard's history is documented. Most importantly, we have the truth on our side. And truth has a way of being recognized by people who know how to look for it. The next morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical London weather that seemed to match Timothy's nervous mood. He and Eleanor dressed carefully for their meeting, understanding that their appearance would contribute to the impression they made on Margaret Whitfield. Eleanor chose her best dress and a neat coat, while Timothy wore his cleanest school uniform. They arrived at the palace's east entrance 30 minutes early, wanting to ensure they wouldn't be late for such an important appointment. The staff entrance was much less imposing than the main gates where Timothy had met with Morrison, but it felt equally significant given what was at stake. At exactly 2 o'clock, they approached the guard at the staff entrance and asked for Margaret Whitfield. The guard made a brief phone call, then directed them to wait in a small reception area inside the building. Timothy had never been inside any part of the palace before, and despite his anxiety, he found himself amazed by the elegant architecture and formal atmosphere. Margaret Whitfield appeared after a few minutes, a professional-looking woman with graying hair and intelligent eyes. She greeted Eleanor warmly, clearly pleased to meet someone with such a long history of palace service. Her manner with Timothy was kind but serious, reflecting the gravity of the situation they were addressing. "Mrs. Matthews," Margaret said, "Sergeant Morrison has told me about your family's situation and the evidence you've gathered regarding your son's case. I've agreed to review this material because of your years of faithful service here and because the case as described appears to involve a serious miscarriage of justice." Margaret led them to a small office in the correspondence department, a quiet space lined with filing cabinets and dominated by a large wooden desk. She invited Eleanor and Timothy to sit while she reviewed their documentation carefully. Timothy watched Margaret's face as she examined each piece of evidence. Her expression remained neutral and professional, but he could see that she was reading everything thoroughly and taking notes as she reviewed the witness statements and supporting documents. "The witness testimony about your son's whereabouts on the evening in question is quite detailed," Margaret observed. "These people are willing to testify under oath about seeing him help repair Mrs. Henderson's roof?" "Yes," Eleanor replied. "I've spoken with each of them personally. They remember the evening clearly because it was unusual for someone to be doing roof work so late in the day, but Robert wanted to finish the job before the weather turned bad." Margaret nodded and continued reviewing the documents about the security guard's employment history. "This information about Mr. Peterson's previous dismissals for falsifying reports is particularly interesting. How did you obtain these employment records?" Eleanor explained how she had contacted Peterson's former employers directly, presenting herself as someone conducting a character reference check. Most of the employers had been willing to share general information about his dismissals, especially when Eleanor mentioned that it was related to a legal matter. "And this witness who saw Peterson placing something in your son's truck," Margaret continued, "she's prepared to provide sworn testimony about what she observed?" "Mrs. Chen is nervous about getting involved," Timothy said, speaking for the first time since they had arrived. "But she knows it was wrong to stay silent when she saw something suspicious. She said she would testify if it could help prove my father's innocence." Margaret spent nearly an hour reviewing every piece of evidence and asking detailed questions about how it had been gathered. She was particularly interested in the timeline of events and the various witnesses' ability to provide precise details about dates and times. Finally, Margaret set down the documents and looked directly at Eleanor and Timothy. "I must tell you that in my 20 years of handling correspondence and requests for intervention, I rarely see cases with evidence this comprehensive and credible. If these witness statements are accurate and can be verified, they strongly suggest that your son was wrongfully convicted." Timothy felt his heart leap with hope, but Margaret's serious expression warned him that challenges remained. "However," Margaret continued, "getting this evidence properly presented to the court system will require very careful handling. The palace cannot directly intervene in legal proceedings, but there are established channels for bringing credible evidence of wrongful conviction to the attention of appropriate authorities." Margaret explained that she would need to present the case to Sir David Thornton, the palace's senior advisor on legal and constitutional matters. Sir David had connections throughout the justice system and occasionally facilitated the review of cases that appeared to involve serious miscarriages of justice. "If Sir David agrees that your case merits special attention," Margaret said, "he can arrange for your evidence to be reviewed by prosecutors who have the authority to request a formal investigation. This could potentially lead to your son's conviction being overturned." Eleanor leaned forward in her chair. "What do we need to do to make this happen?" "First, I need to verify the credibility of your witnesses by conducting brief telephone interviews with them. If they confirm their willingness to provide sworn testimony, and their accounts remain consistent, I'll prepare a formal case summary for Sir David's review." Margaret warned them that even with Sir David's support, the legal process could take several months to complete. However, if the evidence was as strong as it appeared, there was a possibility that Robert's appeal hearing could be delayed pending the formal investigation. "Time is crucial," Timothy said urgently. "My father's appeal hearing is in 4 days. If the court doesn't hear this evidence soon, he could spend years in prison." Margaret nodded understandingly. "I'm aware of the timeline pressure. If Sir David agrees to take on this case, his first step would be to contact the court about delaying the appeal hearing pending the presentation of new evidence. This is an unusual request, but it's not unprecedented in cases involving potential wrongful conviction." As their meeting concluded, Margaret provided Eleanor with her direct telephone number and promised to begin the witness verification process immediately. She estimated that she could complete her review and present the case to Sir David within 2 days, potentially leaving time to influence Robert's appeal hearing. "Mrs. Matthews, Timothy," Margaret said as they prepared to leave, "I want you to know that regardless of the outcome, you've done everything possible to seek justice for your family. The evidence you've gathered represents months of careful work, and your persistence in finding the right channels to present it shows remarkable determination." Walking away from the palace, Timothy felt more hopeful than he had in months, but also more anxious than ever. They had finally gotten their evidence into the hands of someone with real authority to help, but the next few days would determine whether their efforts would be enough to save his father. Margaret Whitfield worked late into the evening, making careful telephone calls to each of the witnesses whose statements could prove Robert Matthews' innocence. She approached each conversation professionally but sensitively, understanding that these ordinary citizens were nervous about becoming involved in a legal matter that had already sent someone to prison. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly neighbor whose roof Robert had been repairing, was the first person Margaret contacted. Despite her advanced age, Mrs. Henderson's memory of that evening was crystal clear. She remembered feeling grateful that Robert had insisted on finishing the repair work despite the late hour, and she could provide specific details about their conversations during the work. "That young man worked until well past dark," Mrs. Henderson told Margaret. "I kept offering to let him finish the next day, but he said rain was coming, and he didn't want my roof to leak. He was there from about 6 in the evening until nearly 10 o'clock. I remember because I had to turn on my porch light so he could see what he was doing." The second witness, a neighbor named Mr. Jackson who had helped carry roofing materials, confirmed the timeline and added additional details about Robert's presence that evening. Most importantly, Mr. Jackson had taken several photographs of the completed roof repair the next morning, and the metadata on his digital camera would provide electronic verification of the date and time. Mrs. Chen, the witness who had seen the security guard Peterson placing something in Robert's truck, was more nervous about speaking with Margaret. However, once she understood that her testimony could help prove an innocent man's innocence, she became more forthcoming about what she had observed. "I saw Mr. Peterson at the construction site the morning after the theft was reported," Mrs. Chen explained. "He was walking around the parking area where the workers kept their trucks. When he thought no one was watching, he went to Mr. Matthews's truck and put something in the bed of the truck, then covered it with a tarp. I thought it was strange because Mr. Matthews wasn't at work that day." Margaret's final call was to Mr. Garcia, who had worked at Peterson's previous job and could testify about the security guard's history of filing false reports. Mr. Garcia confirmed that Peterson had been fired for submitting incident reports about thefts and safety violations that investigation proved had never occurred. By midnight, Margaret had completed her witness verification and was convinced that the Matthews family had assembled legitimate evidence of Robert's innocence. She spent the rest of the night preparing a comprehensive case summary for Sir David Thornton, including detailed witness statements, timeline analysis, and supporting documentation. The next morning, Margaret requested an urgent meeting with Sir David, emphasizing the time-sensitive nature of the case due to the scheduled appeal hearing. Sir David, a distinguished gentleman in his 60s with decades of experience in legal and constitutional matters, agreed to review the case immediately. Margaret presented the evidence methodically, starting with the witness testimony about Robert's whereabouts during the alleged crime, then moving to the information about Peterson's history of false reports, and finally discussing Mrs. Chen's testimony about seeing Peterson plant evidence in Robert's truck. Sir David listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions about the witness's credibility and the verification process Margaret had conducted. His expression grew increasingly serious as he reviewed the documented evidence of what appeared to be a deliberate frame-up. "Margaret," Sir David said after completing his review, "this case represents exactly the type of situation where intervention may be both appropriate and necessary. The evidence suggests not only that Mr. Matthews is innocent, but that he may have been deliberately framed by someone in a position of trust." Sir David explained that he would immediately contact Chief Prosecutor Helen Bradshaw, a respected figure in the justice system who specialized in reviewing cases involving potential wrongful convictions. If Ms. Bradshaw agreed that the evidence warranted investigation, she could request that Robert's appeal hearing be postponed pending a formal review of the new evidence. "The key," Sir David continued, "is presenting this information in a way that emphasizes both the strength of the evidence and the urgency of the timeline. Ms. Bradshaw will need to be convinced that this case deserves immediate attention despite her busy schedule." Meanwhile, Timothy spent the day trying to concentrate on his schoolwork while constantly wondering what was happening at the palace. His teacher noticed his distraction and asked if everything was all right at home, but Timothy could only say that his family was dealing with some difficulties and he hoped things would improve soon. Eleanor received a phone call from Margaret that afternoon, informing her that the case had been presented to Sir David and that he was taking immediate action to contact the appropriate authorities. Margaret warned that the next 24 hours would be crucial in determining whether they could influence Robert's appeal hearing. That evening, Chief Prosecutor Helen Bradshaw reviewed the case summary in her office, staying late to give it the careful attention such a serious matter deserved. She had seen many cases over her career where new evidence emerged after conviction, but rarely had she encountered such a comprehensive collection of witness testimony and supporting documentation presented so close to an appeal hearing. Ms. Bradshaw was particularly struck by the systematic nature of the evidence gathering and the credibility of the witnesses involved. The Matthews family had essentially conducted their own investigation with remarkable thoroughness, uncovering information that should have been discovered during the original trial. After completing her review, Ms. Bradshaw made 2 important phone calls. The first was to the judge scheduled to hear Robert's appeal, requesting an emergency postponement based on the presentation of substantial new evidence. The second was to Detective Inspector Williams, who supervised criminal investigations in the jurisdiction where Robert's case had been prosecuted. Detective Inspector Williams agreed to meet with Ms. Bradshaw the following morning to review the evidence and determine whether it warranted reopening the investigation into the original theft charges. If the evidence proved credible under official scrutiny, Robert could potentially be released pending a complete review of his case. As Tuesday evening turned into Wednesday morning, Timothy lay awake in his grandmother's flat, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine what his father might be thinking in his prison cell. Robert had no idea that his family had spent months gathering evidence to prove his innocence, or that at this very moment some of the most influential people in the British justice system were reviewing testimony that could set him free. The appeal hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning. Timothy realized that in less than 24 hours his family would know whether their desperate efforts had been enough to save his father, or whether Robert would face years more in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Eleanor found Timothy sitting by the window in the early morning hours, watching the sunrise over London. She sat beside him and took his hand, offering the quiet comfort that had sustained him throughout this ordeal. Tomorrow we'll know, Timothy said quietly. Tomorrow we'll know, Eleanor agreed. But regardless of what happens, you should be proud of what you've accomplished. You've fought for your father with everything you have, and that means more than you may ever realize. Wednesday morning brought a flurry of activity in the corridors of justice that Timothy and his family could only wait and hope to influence. Detective Inspector Williams arrived at Chief Prosecutor Bradshaw's office, carrying the complete case file from Robert Matthews' original investigation, ready to compare the new evidence against what had been presented during the trial. Ms. Bradshaw spread the witness statements and supporting documentation across her conference table, walking Detective Inspector Williams through each piece of evidence that the Matthews family had gathered. The detective's expression grew increasingly troubled as he realized how much crucial information had been overlooked during the original investigation. This witness testimony about Matthews' whereabouts is ironclad, Detective Inspector Williams said, reviewing Mrs. Henderson's detailed statement. If he was repairing her roof 20 miles away when the theft occurred, there's no possible way he could have committed this crime. The detective was particularly concerned about the information regarding security guard Peterson's history of filing false reports. We should have discovered Peterson's employment history during our background checks, he admitted. This represents a serious failure in our investigative process. Ms. Bradshaw nodded gravely. The question now is whether we can move quickly enough to prevent a miscarriage of justice from becoming permanent. Mr. Matthews' appeal hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning, and if we don't act immediately, he could spend years more in prison while we conduct a proper investigation. The two officials spent the morning verifying the new evidence through official channels. Detective Inspector Williams contacted Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Jackson, and Mrs. Chen directly, conducting formal interviews that would create official police records of their testimony. Meanwhile, Ms. Bradshaw's staff worked to obtain Peterson's complete employment history from all of his previous positions. By noon, the official verification process had confirmed what Margaret Whitfield had already established. The Matthews family had gathered legitimate, credible evidence that strongly suggested Robert's innocence. More troubling still, the evidence pointed toward deliberate misconduct by Peterson, who appeared to have fabricated evidence to frame Robert for a crime Peterson himself might have committed. Ms. Bradshaw made the decision to request an emergency hearing with Judge Morrison, who was scheduled to hear Robert's appeal the following morning. In her formal request, she outlined the new evidence and asked for Robert's immediate release pending a complete reinvestigation of the charges against him. Meanwhile, Timothy spent Wednesday afternoon at the palace gates, hoping to see Sergeant Morrison and learn whether their efforts had achieved anything. Morrison was not at his usual post, but another guard recognized Timothy and discreetly informed him that Morrison had been called away on urgent business related to a matter of justice. Eleanor spent the day in her flat, alternating between nervous cleaning and quiet prayer. She had done everything possible to help her son, but the final outcome was now in the hands of people she had never met, operating within a system she only partially understood. Late Wednesday afternoon, Margaret Whitfield called Eleanor with an update that sent waves of hope and anxiety through the small flat. "Mrs. Matthews," Margaret said carefully, "I cannot give you specific details, but I can tell you that your case has received the serious attention it deserved. Formal procedures are now in motion that could significantly affect your son's situation." Margaret could not provide more specific information due to legal constraints, but she advised Eleanor to ensure that the family would be available for important phone calls and possible legal meetings on Thursday morning. That evening, Robert Matthews sat in his prison cell, unaware that his fate was being decided in offices and courtrooms across London. He had spent months maintaining his innocence while watching his family struggle with the consequences of his imprisonment. His faith in justice had been severely tested, but he continued to believe that truth would eventually prevail. Thursday morning arrived gray and cold, with a light rain that matched the anxiety Timothy felt as he prepared for what could be the most important day of his family's life. Eleanor had barely slept, and Timothy's mother, Sarah, had taken the day off from work to be available for any developments. At 9 o'clock, the phone rang in Eleanor's flat. Timothy watched his grandmother's face as she answered, trying to read her expression for clues about what she was hearing. Eleanor's eyes widened, then filled with tears as she listened to the voice on the other end of the line. Yes, Eleanor said into the phone. Yes, we understand. Thank you. Thank you so much. Timothy and his mother stared at Eleanor as she hung up the phone, her hands shaking slightly as she turned to face them. That was a solicitor calling on behalf of Chief Prosecutor Bradshaw, Eleanor said, her voice trembling with emotion. Robert's appeal hearing has been postponed indefinitely. Based on the evidence we provided, Judge Morrison has ordered Robert's immediate release pending a complete reinvestigation of his case. Timothy felt the room spinning around him as the full meaning of his grandmother's words sank in. His father was coming home. After months of imprisonment, after weeks of desperate efforts to prove his innocence, after days of uncertainty about whether anyone would listen to their evidence, Robert Matthews was finally going to be free. Sarah collapsed into a chair, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. The months of working double shifts, of worrying about legal fees, of trying to explain to Emma why her father couldn't come home, had finally come to an end. When? Timothy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. This afternoon, Eleanor replied. He should be home by evening. The reinvestigation that followed would eventually reveal the full scope of Peterson's misconduct. The security guard had indeed stolen the tools himself, then planted one of them in Robert's truck to deflect suspicion. Peterson's history of filing false reports at previous jobs established a pattern of behavior that supported the prosecution's case against him. Within 6 months, Peterson was convicted of theft and evidence tampering, while Robert's conviction was formally overturned. The Matthews family received a public apology from the police department and compensation for the months of wrongful imprisonment Robert had endured. But for Timothy, the most important moment came that Thursday evening when his father walked through the door of Eleanor's flat, free and vindicated. Robert embraced his family with tears streaming down his face, finally understanding how a 10-year-old boy's courage and an elderly woman's wisdom had saved him from years of unjust imprisonment. Sergeant Morrison continued his duties at Buckingham Palace, never seeking recognition for his role in connecting the Matthews family with the people who could help them. Margaret Whitfield returned to her regular correspondence duties, satisfied that the informal networks of assistance within the palace had once again served their proper purpose. Eleanor Matthews looked at her grandson with profound pride, knowing that Timothy had learned lessons about courage, persistence, and justice that would serve him well throughout his life. The secret signal that had started everything was now just a memory, but the bonds it had created between ordinary people and those in positions to help would endure long after the immediate crisis had passed. Timothy never forgot that sometimes the most important acts of courage happen quietly, without fanfare or recognition, and that a desperate child's willingness to approach a palace guard with a simple gesture could set in motion events that changed everything for a family in need of justice.